Hi, this is Father George Williams, and welcome to another of our CPMC, Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition webinars. Today we have Chrisanne Villancourt Murphy, who is the director of the Catholic Mobilizing Network, and Dale Resinella, chaplain on Florida's death row and author of some of the best prison ministry books I've ever read. And I'll let him say more about those books. But if you haven't read them, you need to if you're interested in this kind of work. Today we're going to be talking about witnessing for life in the face of death row. And before we begin the discussion, though, I want to give one quick plug for a webinar that Chrisanne and I did, not a webinar, a podcast that Chrisanne and I did on October 10th, which was the World Day Against the Death Penalty. That's available on our CPMC website. It's about 45 minutes long. So be sure to check that out too. But welcome, Chrisanne and Dale. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father George. Well, I guess I'll kick us off. So good to be with you both, and thank you all for channeling in today to the webinar. It's good to be with you during Pro-Life, Respect Life Month, and to talk about a critical issue of our time. I have the pleasure of introducing Brother Dale to you, but I just want to give you a sense of what we're going to do in our time together today. Brother Dale has extensive experience on Florida's death row, and so he's going to paint some of the backstory, the human story of the death penalty for those of you who may have some exposure to what it's like to live on death row, or just the epidemic of death row and the death penalty in our country. And then I'm going to step back and give more of a bird's eye view of what the trend is in this country, moving away from the death penalty and ultimately to actions that you can take to be part of calling for abolition and calling for the value of all human life, innocent or guilty, especially for those who are incarcerated. So as by way of introduction, I just want to say Brother Dale is a friend of mine, and he is a real hero in this movement. He and his wife Susan have been doing death row ministry in different ways, but together very much as a unit over the past 21 years. A couple things about Brother Dale. He's the president of I Was in Prison Outreach Ministry, and he's a licensed attorney. So this is really his second career, the last 20 or so years of working on death row. He works on behalf of the Florida Catholic Conference of Bishops. He began in 1998 to do cell-to-cell ministry to approximately the 400 men on death row and approximately 2,000 men in Florida's long-term solitary confinement. His wife Susan is a licensed psychologist, and she ministers with Brother Dale to the families and to those who are left behind in terms of those people who are on death row and their loved ones. One of my favorite things that Dale has said, and I think it really just encapsulates who you are, Dale, is that you say that the death penalty is a system that some believe in the United States that we should have, but it's not the death penalty that exists, and you call it a American death penalty fantasy. But you come at this work from a faith perspective, and really just want to give you a chance to maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll play the video of a person who's currently serving on death row, who has a strong claim of innocence, who Dale has been walking with every step of the way, who has an execution date set for November 7th, so just a few weeks from now. So Brother Dale, why don't you give us a little bit of your background, and then we'll show the video and have you fill in this picture for us.
Thank you, Chrisanne, and thank you, Father George. And to all our participants, it's wonderful to be with you this afternoon, and thank you for making the time to join us. With over 20 years of ministry and speaking and writing and responding to questions from all over the country on the U.S. death penalty, I have been deeply impressed by the chasm between what people think our death penalty is and what it actually is. And without exception, when I have been able to introduce people to the actual death penalty that we have, how it really works, or more accurately, how it really doesn't work, they are astounded that what they thought we had is so far afield from what we actually have. The death penalty in the United States is a fiction, and it's also an anathema to our faith, because our faith is pro-life. Our faith is to support the gift of human life given by God and not to take it as human beings, except in very rare circumstances where in that moment it's necessary to use lethal force to protect innocent life under direct attack. And of course, when we have people that have been sitting on death row in prisons for 10, 20, 30, 40 or more years, and who barely have any infractions on the rules, and the ones they do have may be for having too many stamps or having too many pieces of paper in their locker, one has to ask, what are we accomplishing now by executing them? Society's been safe for decades. They haven't done anything in decades, even if they were guilty of the original crime. What are we accomplishing by the arbitrary, gratuitous taking of human life now? And when the possibility exists, a serious possibility, that the person we're getting ready to kill is in fact innocent, how horrible, morally and ethically, is the position we are putting ourselves in by gratuitously taking that human life. So I think, Chris-Ann, I'd like to stop there and go to the video, and then I'll respond to the video with a few more remarks.
Absolutely. I just want to let folks know that they can ask questions along the way in the chat, and we will be sorting through those again along the time of the webinar. Let me share my screen with you so you can see this video. 2 minutes. Hang on. Can you all see it? it, Dale.
Quite a powerful little video. And it makes the point extremely well that we are on treacherous ground when we are looking at the possibility of executing an innocent man. And this is not something new. My first book, The Biblical Truth About America's Death Penalty, dealt extensively with what's really in Scripture and how the concerns of the biblical death penalty, when it was the law of the land, adamantly focused on making sure that we never, ever executed an innocent man. Exodus 23:7 have nothing to do with the execution of an innocent person. And none other than St. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa, said point blank, not the killing, the execution of an innocent person is intrinsically evil. That's the same moral gravity that we as Catholics attach to procured abortion. It's the same gravity. So why would we be considering the execution of a possibly innocent man who's been on death row for more than 30 years with hardly even a minuscule disciplinary infraction for non-essential items, and risking the commission of an act by us that cannot be justified morally in any way, shape, or form? This is very serious. The Bible took it seriously. Our church takes it seriously, and we need to take it seriously. And in addition to all of that, we have a man who served his country in Vietnam for 3 tours of duty and an additional tour of duty in Korea. I was astounded after coming to this work 21 years ago to find out how many veterans are on death row in the United States. And Florida is well above the national average of 10%. We have over 18% of our death row is composed of veterans, primarily of our foreign wars. The death penalty that we have is not the death penalty people think we have. And my experience and the experience of so many others like Sister Helen and the folks here in Florida who work to bring the truth to the good people of our state and the good people of our country, our experience is that when people find out what our death penalty really is and how it really works, especially, for example, in cases of the innocent or veterans, their response is almost always, "Don't do that for me. Don't do that for me. Don't do it for any of us." So, Chrisanne, thank you for the opportunity to share with our participants a little bit of my experiences and of my experience with a person like Mr. James Daly, who served his country honorably and is now facing execution 4 days before Veterans Day for a crime that he's highly likely innocent of. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. We did have a question around Jack Percy because he did sign an affidavit confessing to the murder. in this case. Can you give us any clarification on that, why he's sentenced to life, or kind of what some of the nuances? I understand that these are complicated cases, but.
Yeah, it is a complicated case, and all that information is available on the internet. And I am not functioning in this case in a legal capacity. And so it would not be appropriate for me to answer technical questions about Mr. Percy. What I can tell you is that all that information is available on the internet with contact information for Mr. Daly's lawyers, who can provide anything people need to know about the history and the background of how this came about and how Mr. Percy signed an affidavit indicating that he was the person that committed this crime.
Okay, thank you for that, Dale. And someone else had asked about the website at the end of that short little video that does lead to an action, a mercy in action. I'll tell you all a little bit more about that in a moment, but I'll just give you that website because you asked. It's bit.ly, so bit.ly, and then it's /James, James, Daily, Dailey. So JAMES.DAILEY. Okay. So thank you, Dale. We're going to return back to you. I'm going to give sort of some of the background, the kind of the perch view of the death penalty now. So let me share this screen again with y'all. There it is. Okay. So can you all see this? I want it, before I go into that, is that working? Okay. I just wanted to show a picture of Dale. This is rather recent, of Dale being with a private audience with Pope Francis in Rome. And Dale, when we come back to you, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that was like for you. And I think there, you can even tell us what you're thumbing through. Or why don't you do that right now?
Well, what happened is that my most recent book, Chris Ann, When We Visit Jesus in Prison, A Guide to Catholic Ministry, was released in Italy in March in an Italian edition, and is being used there like here to help Catholic lay people be prepared to do prison ministry in jails and prisons and detention facilities, fully employing the tools and fruits of their Catholic faith. And with the release of that book, my wife Susan and I, and that is Susan there on the left, agreed to do a book signing book tour in Italy for the Dominican publisher. And on the very last day, June 11, we were very surprised to find that we had a personal audience with His Holiness Pope Francis, where I was able to share with him a folder with the pictures of the Catholics on death row. There were too many to include everybody, so it included the Catholics, and that number is about 75, and invited him, if it could fit someplace in his journeys, because he's in the air more than anybody else I know, to visit to Florida's death row and meet his children in faith, Catholic and non-Catholic, who admire him and follow him and understand that he really cares about them as people.
Well, we certainly know he called for an end to the death penalty when he was here in September of 2015, and then he ushered in the new catechism revision recently in August of 2018. So how wonderful you got to meet him. I want to go back one second because I didn't want to skip over the books that Dale has mentioned. Of course, When We Visit Jesus in Prison would be your most recent book, Dale?
Yes, Chrisanne, that is the book on general prison ministry. It does mention the death penalty, but it's not the focus. It's on general prison ministry being performed by lay people in the Catholic Church and how to employ their Catholic faith, not just for the people they minister to, but to provide emotional and spiritual support for themselves and their colleagues.
And so valuable, so valuable. And then can you tell us something about Now I Walk on Death Row? Because you did mention about the biblical truth about America's death penalty, but how about the first book?
Yes, after the first book came out, we were very surprised to be contacted by an evangelical publisher who asked if we would be willing, my wife and I, to share our journey as a family with our children, all 5 of them, from my first career in Wall Street finance to what we've been doing for the last 20 some years, which is ministry on death row. And we said we would. And so that book, Now I Walk on Death Row, a Wall Street finance lawyer stumbles into the arms of a loving God. And of course, this ministry and the church's presence on prisons and jails and death rows and detention centers all over the country and all over the world is about mercy. The mercy we all want for ourselves, which Jesus said, as we give it to others, it will be made available to us. So we shared that journey, and that became the book, Now I Walk on Death Row, and it's still receiving a very wide reception.
Wonderful. Pope Francis says that the only way that we're going to root out evil is through mercy. So it's a wonderful reminder, Dale. Thank
Yes,
you.
and Chrisanne, I have been involved in death and dying ministry, either in prison or outside prison, for over 30 years, cancer, AIDS, and now the death penalty. I have prayed with hundreds of men facing their death, and never, ever has even one of them asked me to pray with them for God to give them what they deserve. Every single one, whether a lawyer, a doctor, a politician, whatever it is that is bringing them to face the end of their life, every single one has asked me to pray with them for mercy. And as we give, so we shall receive.
Well said. Well said. Thank you, Dale. I'm going to share a little bit about Catholic Mobilizing Network for you all who perhaps know a little bit about us or maybe have never heard about Catholic Mobilizing. That's our mission statement, a national organization that mobilizes Catholics and all people of goodwill. So we're not exclusively working with Catholics, although we certainly have that emphasis. We value life over death. We seek to put an end to the use of the death penalty and to transform the criminal justice system from punitive to restorative, and to build capacity in the society to engage in restorative practices. So we're for ending the death penalty and then promoting restorative justice. So that is where Catholic Mobilizing Network locates itself. In short, we seek to amplify the church's pro-life teaching on capital punishment. We find that that is the teaching of the church is less well known in terms of its life stance on capital punishment. And so we seek to amplify what the church says. For over 30 years, the church has been, certainly in the US, has been calling for an end to the death penalty. And only recently have we been blessed to have the loophole that was in the catechism clarified or, sort of changed enough, to revised to be crystal clear that the death penalty is inadmissible in every case all the time now. So the church has a very clear stance on the death penalty. So we figure at Catholic Mobilizing Network, we have a fair bit of education, advocacy, and prayer to do on this issue to make a real difference. So on the education front, we offer educational materials at catholicsmobilizing.org. There's a whole bunch of materials that you can see, you can use in your church, in your small group, etc. That's based on the church's teaching, but then in terms of promoting those ideas, those ideals, myths and facts, and some about Catholic social thought and where it intersects with the death penalty and the myriad of issues, justice issues that surround this critical issue of our time. So we focus on education, on advocacy. We help to give folks a handle to work on either repeal campaigns or on executions, seeking for someone's clemency or a stay in an execution. We give folks a handle or a lever to use their voice, their agency, to put their faith into action around this issue. Currently, there are 21 states that do not have the death penalty, and another 4 that are under governor-imposed moratorium. So no executions will be happening under that governor's watch. So about half of the states in the union do not have a practicing death penalty. We have some work to do to get the other half of those states along in that same grouping. So we give folks all sorts of opportunities to weigh in at the state level and then now at the federal level. And then on the prayer front, certainly all of our work is grounded in prayer and utilizing faith formation guides, the liturgical season, parish bulletins, any number of prayer cards, all sorts of prayer mechanisms to get folks thinking about this again from the heart and the head and working to make a difference. So that's Catholic Mobilizing Network's 3-pronged approach. And I'll give you some ideas about how you can get involved in educating, advocacy, and praying around ending the death penalty. So just a few snapshots of what the death penalty really means and what it really looks like in this country at the moment. I can give you a 10-year glance. Catholic Mobilizing has turned 10 in 2019. And so we've spent some time recently reflecting on how far the movement has come, even in the 10 years that we've been explicitly focused on ending the death penalty. So we work in collaboration with secular partners all over the country and other faith traditions who also want to see an end to the death penalty. So we're not alone in this work, but in the time of our work and our history, it's stunning to see the progress that's been made. So the red line that you see is the number of death sentences that are handed out every year. So in 2009, 10 years ago, there were about 118 death sentences doled out by prosecutors around the country annually. And now we're less than half of that, almost basically a third of that in 2019. Again, the blue line on the bottom is the total annual executions. So we have also halved that number from about 50 executions per year to about 25. So it's stunning. We have still lots more work to do, but just so you all understand that getting involved in ending the death penalty, the trending is on our side. What we're doing is working and we need you to be part of it. I would be remiss to not say which states also have abolished the death penalty in these last 10 years. So certainly starting from New Mexico, Illinois is quite historic when they had a moratorium for a number of years in that state because of the flaws they saw in the system. My home state of Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, Washington State, and New Hampshire. Those were some really interesting repeals recently. Washington State, the Supreme Court called the death penalty arbitrary and racially biased. And so the US Supreme Court said, we're not doing it any longer in Washington State. So that was last year in 2018. And then the state of New Hampshire, just in May, actually the state legislature overrode a governor's veto, and the state legislature had pulled out a repeal as well. So that's, again, 21 states who have repealed the death penalty, and Oregon, Colorado, Pennsylvania, and California. Many of you probably heard about California in particular because it's such a large death row. And the new governor there in March came forward right early in his tenure and said, we are not going to have any executions on my watch, and that's the largest death row in the Western Hemisphere. So again, these are tremendous gains and advances in the abolition movement. So if you're wondering if your state has the death penalty or not, I would imagine there's some newcomers to this issue. And in some cases, you may have the death penalty laws on the books, but it's not being practiced very regularly. So I just wanted to point out that you can see, of course, the East Coast has New England with New Hampshire became abolition full. So there's no state in New England that has the death penalty, which is tremendous. You can see now the West Coast as well, between Washington State and the light blue at the top left-hand corner. That's a recent abolition state. And then the two states below, Oregon and California, also have the moratoriums. So you've got some great bookends there along with the upper Midwest. And then in the South, you see there's a stronghold. Out West in those states, it's a stronghold. So we have, again, some work to do. The state of Colorado, which is the blue in the middle of that sea of red, is currently under a moratorium, and there's efforts underway to repeal Colorado's death penalty this very year. That's a target state for Catholic Mobilizing and so many other abolition folks in the movement. So if you're from that state, we need your help. And what else can I tell you about this? I guess it speaks for itself, but I mean, certainly notice, the southern states quite strong. So if you're out there, again, we need your voice, we need your agency. Executions in the United States, I think, especially with what we just saw in terms of the James Daly case, it just hit it home what it really means when there's an execution on the line. So certainly Texas, obviously 565 in this current era of the death penalty, this modern era since 1976, over 500 individuals have been killed in the state of Texas. That's certainly, I would say, the worst perpetrator of this practice in our country. States like Virginia with 113, or Oklahoma on top of Texas there, those are also states that we're constantly watching. Although death row in Virginia is much smaller now, they have said that, if you're on death row in Virginia, you're likely to be killed quite quickly. And then trailing not too far behind is the state of Florida with 99 executions. Dale, did you want to say anything about Florida and exonerations? Because that's so compelling to be living there and working with the people you work with, and then to know it's kind of renowned about exonerations in the state of Florida.
Well, in Florida, we have had an extensive history of exonerations, the most recent one being number 29. And it's kind of shocking that as a state, we are facing with Mr. Daly's case, either our 100th execution or our 30th exoneration. But it does put into sharp relief that under the modern death penalty in Florida since 1976, we have averaged about one exoneration for every 3 executions. Would any of us be willing to drive 70 miles an hour in a car that had a 25% chance of a fatal wreck? And yet that is our death penalty system in Florida. And so it's not anywhere near a good track record. It's not anywhere near a track record that should be defended. Rather, it brings into sharp focus that the death penalty in the United States, even as applied in Florida, is a train wreck. And we need to dump it and move on to better ways of dealing with criminal justice.
Thank you, Dale. I promise we'll go quickly through these slides because I really do want to get to the questions. I'm sure many of you have some. I wanted to point out to the bottom left-hand corner the federal executions. So the current administration has called for a reinstatement of executions at the federal level. So since the 70s, we've only had 3 executions. I think the most recent was in 2003 at the federal level, but there had up till July when this reinstatement was announced, the country hadn't executed anyone at the federal level for 16 years. So that's quite troubling. And that, again, goes absolutely in the opposite direction of the trends that we've been working so hard and the gains we've made over the last 10 to 20 years. This is something I just wanted you all to have this at your fingertips about the racially biased nature of the death penalty. We all know this, but particularly around the race of the person who has been killed. If it's a white person, it tends people tend to get executed because of it. So this explains it very well based on the victim's race. But we certainly know that 76% of death row defendants are executed for killing a white victim. And African Americans make up only 13% of the population, but they're represented by about 42% on death row. So there's all sorts of racial dynamics that are at play. And then just a couple slides about public opinion. This is more generally public opinion. I just want to point out when you look at the 90s, sort of the middle 90s over there to the right, you had 80% of the population in favor of the death penalty. And then you look where we are now in 2019, and that is precipitously lower. It's basically about the halfway point amongst the population. So we've had a lot of progress in terms of folks having a disfavor for the practice, but we still have work to do. And then this is quite interesting too, when you want to look at the gender, the race, the racial affiliation, or the generation of someone's background and how they fare with the death penalty. It's stunning that when you look at, women versus men, or evangelical Protestants versus mainline versus Catholics, where people fall, we have some work to do with 53% of Catholics, according to Pew, being in favor of the death penalty. So we know that changes if you look at the dependent tabulation on someone's race and them being Catholic. That can change. So we're doing okay, but certainly given the clarity of the church's teaching now and formation around this issue, we can make a big difference with Catholics. So that's where we focus and why we focus on Catholics. And then the last couple of things, just in terms of executions. Jim Daly is an example of the executions that are happening in Florida. Right now this year, 7 folks have been executed in the state of Texas, and there are 4 more Texas executions pending right now between now and the end of 2019. But this also gives you a sense of where death penalty is practiced. So I think you really begin to see and hone in on the geography of, again, this failed system. I'm going to click quickly to executions, because Catholic Mobilizing site, catholicsmobilizing.org, has execution scheduled. Basically, you can see anyone who has an execution date scheduled. So you see James Daly in the middle there for November 7th, but it goes all the way out till November 20th. And you can see some that are even pending for the month of October. I also want to point out another particular case on the 20th of November, Rodney Reed. Not all executions or cases of folks on death row involve innocence, especially strong claims of innocence. But I want you all to know that Rodney Reed is similar to James Daly, has an incredibly strong innocence case. So 2 folks currently sitting on death row with a scheduled execution imminent are claiming very strong innocence. Rodney Reed's case was just brought, kind of popularized, but necessarily so, on the Dr. Phil show. That was just, I think it ran last week or 2 weeks ago. So that wouldn't be hard to find on the internet. But I just wanted you all to see that you can access not just one execution, but the array of executions that are scheduled. So moving forward, a couple things just in terms of how you all can get involved. And again, we want to take your questions. So I'll just put a couple of ideas out for you. This is Respect Life Month. That's why we're talking about witnessing for life in the face of death row. Catholic Mobilizing helps Catholics and people of goodwill learn what tools are at their disposal for organizing and making a difference on this issue. So I'm just clicking into Catholic Mobilizing Respect Life Month Toolkit, which is in the paper copy, but it's also something that you can easily access on the internet. So you can just scroll down, see any number of these resources, like the first one, Standing for Life. That's the papal proclamations, the position of the church and the last three popes who have declared it so emphatically, but also, graphic cards like the Catholic social teaching and the death penalty, and then more resources on restorative justice, sort of building a system that's different, that holds in the center of our focus, not just the crime that was committed, but the victim and what the victim's needs are and how we can move towards healing and possibly even reconciliation. So giving you some tools to learn about restorative justice and find ways to bring it into your parish, your home, and into hopefully our criminal justice system. So all sorts of parish bulletin resources. We have a blog, so you can get stories, more about, let's see, there are book lists and our film list if you want to do something like that with folks in your community. So those are a couple resources. I'll just point you to the National Catholic Pledge to End the Death Penalty. It's on our website. We have those cards. They look like postcards. And it's something that we'd be happy to send out to you, or you can sign it online. It's basically saying, I pledge to do my part in educating, advocating, and praying for an end to the death penalty. So click on that when we'll send this out to you, or visit our website. And then the Mercy in Action Project. We have ways for you to chime in and try to voice your opposition to the death penalty, and certainly to executions that are scheduled through our Mercy in Action Project, where you can do a one-click letter, and you can customize that letter as well. So that bit.ly that we showed you for James Daly gets you into the Mercy in Action letter for James Daly, and it's focusing on Governor DeSantis. So please customize those. There's some sample language and whatnot, but when a letter is perceived to be more of a, something that you've written yourself, and it's not just a form letter, those are taken more seriously. So I'd point you to that as well. So now we're moving into questions and answers. I will stop sharing all these slides, and some of our team here have been kind of vetting out the questions. So let me take a look. I guess, Dale, we'll start with you for the first one. Why do you think church leaders have been quiet about the death penalty? And especially in this Respect Life Month, when we're really trying to show the value of all life at all stages of life, why has the church been mostly only focused on abortion? I know that that's an issue you've worked closely on as well.
My experience is at variance with the assumptions of the question. In the parishes we attend here in Florida, we have found that the pastors and the deacons have tried very hard to make sure to include the death penalty as an issue along with other Respect Life issues during Respect Life Month and also at other times of the year. And that can be as finely tuned as including in the prayers of the faithful, prayers to end abortion and the death penalty in our society. So I'm sure there's never a perfect balance, but my experience is that we have had a willingness by our priests and deacons here in North Florida to include the death penalty and the church's teaching on the death penalty along with the other life issues. What I have experienced is that many Catholics, not all, not even a majority, but just a significant minority, appear to be concerned that by including the death penalty as a life issue, it's going to water down the focus on abortion. My response to that, and mainly I've encountered this when I speak in Texas, where I was actually confronted by very wonderful Catholics that said, no one here has ever heard that the church is against the death penalty. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. I live in Florida. But they certainly were concerned that if the church in Texas was talking about the death penalty as a life issue, it might dilute the focus on abortion and cost them some of their support fighting against legalized abortion. My answer on that is the same. That's not the approach we take when we are deploying our resources to protect the country in a battle or to engage an enemy in a battle. The approach we take is hit all the fronts, all the vulnerabilities, and work elbow and elbow, arm in arm to move the front forward. And that's always the way I have felt we have to approach the life issues. There's not enough time for any of us to work on all the life issues, but there's enough time for every single one of us to work on some of them. And so while at this point in my life, God has primarily called my wife and I to address the issues of capital punishment from the number of life issues that are facing us in our culture, earlier in my life, I was speaking to young people as a college student on the issue of legalizing abortion. And I've spoken on other life issues. So we need to look at the entire menu of life issues before us and prayerfully discern which one is God calling me to spend my time and my talent addressing at this time, and to support and assist those that are being called to deal with the others. The battle for life is a broad spectrum battle. And just like fighting an infection that requires a broad spectrum antibiotic, we need a broad spectrum battle in our culture to defend the value of human life. And those of us who are working in this arena, whichever part of it we're called to right now, need to support and assist those being called to the other life issues. And I welcome the support of my brother and sister Catholics who are working on other life issues to support me and those that are working in the area of capital punishment.
Thank you, Brother Dale. I would say for one of the folks that was asking about lay leadership or mentioning lay leadership, I think Brother Dale is a perfect example of a lay leader, and Catholic Mobilizing Network is an organization that's based in lay leadership. It's the point was that, you know, it's not just priests and deacons that can be doing this work, it's all of us. And it sounds from what you've just said, Dale, it requires all of us to lock arm in arm and be on all fronts in defending life. And so the more lay leaders that we can get, the body of Christ, and working to do this work, the more likely we are to succeed, certainly with God's good grace. Here's another question for you. Are there women on death row, and do you have any connection with the women? What's it look like in Florida?
There are women on death row in Florida, and we do execute women in Florida. There are women on death row in other states, and there are women that have been executed in other states. In Florida, the death row that houses women is not where the death row for men is. So in Rayford and Stark, Florida, here in northeast Florida, is the death row for men. The death row for women is in central Florida, down by Ocala. And so I have not had the opportunity or been requested to minister to women on death row in Florida. The death row for women is in the Diocese of Orlando. My understanding is that there is significant ministry by the Catholic Church, both from clergy and trained lay people, for the death row for women in the Orlando Diocese.
Mm-hmm.
And when a woman's death warrant is signed, she is brought to the death house up in Northeast Florida at Florida State Prison. That's the only death house for the whole state. And services from the Catholic Church will be available to her, and whatever she would like to avail herself of will be offered to her, just like it is for the men.
Dale, somebody mentioned that your bishop, I believe it would be Bishop Walk, is actually visiting death row, perhaps, and maybe even visiting James Daly. Someone had mentioned that.
Yeah, it is the bishop who is over death row out of the Diocese of St. Augustine.
Mm.
So as Catholics, we understand that Episcopal jurisdiction is based in geographic diocese, and the death row in Florida for men is in the Diocese of St. Augustine, and the death house is in the Diocese of St. Augustine. Since my wife and I moved back to Tallahassee, and I make the commute over to death row from here in Tallahassee, we are back in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, which also has a wonderful bishop. Incidentally, last time I checked, still the youngest bishop in North America, Bishop Walk, originally from San Antonio, Texas. And he's extremely supportive of the work that is being done by the church and the volunteers on death row here in Florida. Now, Bishop Estevez, as the Bishop of St. Augustine, where death row is and where the death house is, will be making cell front visits at the death row in Florida this week. And in the course of those visits, he's also arranged to be able to have a sacramental pastoral time with Mr. Jim Daly, who is a practicing Catholic, at the death row prison in Stark, Florida.
Thank you. So a couple other questions. We have probably about 3 more minutes. I just want to kind of go through them quickly. Someone had asked about how do we get Catholics to change their minds about the death penalty? How do we get them involved and get our clergy to talk about the issue, especially in the state of Texas? I'll just kind of put that out there, and Dale, you can be thinking about some of your responses. Another one was, I'm sorry. Another one was on, I'm sorry, I lost the other one I wanted to do. What advocacy would you recommend to someone who lives in an active death penalty state versus an abolition state? And then lastly, about the federal death row, who is supporting the efforts there? So Dale, do you want to say anything about how we can get folks more involved, clergy and others, to speak about this, especially at Mass?
Well, my experience in getting people, whether lay or clergy, more involved in this issue echoes the experience that Sister Helen Prejean shares when she gives her talks. She started out by becoming a pen pal. And the ultimate horror of the death penalty is what it does to human beings. And so by becoming involved, even if it's just with one person, as a pen pal or as a religious volunteer involved in Bible studies, or as a person making a visit, getting involved with just one person rarely doesn't change a person's attitude on the death penalty. Because as soon as one is in touch tangibly with what this does to people and their families, they experience a drastic change in their support for the death penalty. Another thing that's very important is becoming involved in outreach to the families of the murder victims. People assume that murder victims' families get a benefit from this. it's a real eye-opening experience for people who supported the death penalty to really get in touch with the families of murder victims and with what they need, not just for healing, but sometimes just to survive, and to find out that with all the oxygen in the room, or in this case, all the money in sight being soaked up by the legal process, there's little or nothing left in energy or money to really assist the people that have been hurt the most severely by the crime. So anyone who is willing to step forward and get involved in outreach to those who are facing the death penalty, and outreach to the families of those who are facing the death penalty, and in outreach to the families of victims of murder, will have a tremendous epiphany. And I am sure God will use that to great positive effect.
No doubt, no doubt. I'm going to answer just, I think, a couple of questions myself as well, just in terms of the advocacy components. There are groups ministering to those on federal death row, and the federal death row, especially the place where the executions will happen beginning December 9th around federal executions, is in Terre Haute, Indiana. So we're working closely with groups on the ground there. There's a number of Catholic sisters who have been keeping vigil for years, and certainly had met some of those that were even killed in 2003 at the last execution. So we're working with sisters on the ground. You can contact our website and see what we're doing in Indiana. Another in terms of abolition, trying to work in active death penalty states versus abolition states. For the death penalty states, I would say look at the map on Catholic Mobilizing's website, and you can click to see, once you click on the state itself, it'll bring up a narrative of some of the most recent things that have happened in your state, and then who the local partners are. Often there's local, either a state Catholic conference or an alternatives to the death penalty, a secular organization that's working on this issue, or other faith groups that follow this closely on the ground. So that's who we work with. From the national level to the local level. And then also action steps that you can take for that particular state. Certainly if there's executions happening or repeal, we'll let you know exactly how to weigh in on those actions. In terms of federal executions, I would say one thing that you can do that could be very helpful is to write a letter to the editor, because now we're talking about not just a state issue, state by state, repeal or executions. We're talking about federal executions resuming, again, moving completely in a wrong-headed direction. So that needs to be voiced. People can speak from their faith perspective and write a letter to the editor. Catholic Mobilizing's website has a letter to the editor webinar and kind of handbook and tools for how to do that. So you can write to your diocesan paper, you can write to your local paper. If you know someone who's a person of influence or a political leader who might want to step out on this issue, you can help them usher in, kind of the courage to step forward and speak publicly about this, these executions again happening. So in terms of pen pal, you can, because Dale, you mentioned it, and I think that's so true, that humanizing, that relationship building, and that creating, just demystifying who's on death row. And the collateral damage for the victims' family members, or the people who are the family members of those who are sitting on death row. You can become a pen pal by looking at the CPMC, so the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition's website. They have a Seeking to Minister link, and you can just drop down and see how to write, get connected with a pen pal. Father George, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about that.
Yes, thank you. And I just wanted to break in at the end and thank both of you for absolutely fascinating, lively conversation. Judging from the chat and the input of our viewers today, our participants, I think we need to do this again, because it's such an important topic. And thank you both for the wonderful work you're doing. I want to give a plug for our next CPMC webinar, which is scheduled for Tuesday, November 12th. And the purpose of the next webinar will be to show people how to navigate our new website. You were just describing a feature of it, Chris-Ann, but we want to go into more detail because the whole purpose of the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition website was to be a kind of a go-to place for people engaged or interested in being engaged in jail and prison ministry, either with prisoners, with families, with staff. We want to be the national go-to place for all of these resources. And so that's going to be on Tuesday, November 12th at 10 a.m. West Coast time and 1 p.m. East Coast time. So thank you both very much again for your presence and most especially for your work.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Father.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for chiming in.